I stared at the empty space where my savings account used to be, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. $4,700. Gone. Vanished in a single afternoon like it had never existed at all. My best friend of 16 years, the woman who had stood beside me through everything, the woman I trusted more than I trusted myself, had just cleaned me out. And somehow, impossibly, she'd made me feel like I was the one who owed her an apology. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where this whole nightmare actually began. Back to when life still made sense. My name is Rebecca Hartley, and I'm 39 years old. I work as a paramedic for the County Emergency Services, a job I've held for 14 years. It's brutal work sometimes, the kind of work that peels away your illusions about how safe the world really is. But it's honest work. I help people when they're at their absolute worst, and most days, I'm pretty good at it. The pay isn't spectacular, but after 16 years of marriage to my husband David, after the mortgage on our little suburban home and the everyday expenses that pile up like snow in winter, I'd managed to scrape together a modest emergency fund. $4,700. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. It represented discipline, sacrifice, and the kind of security that lets you sleep at night. We lived in Willowbrook Estates, one of those planned communities about 20 miles outside the city. You know the type. 3 or 4 variations of houses repeated over and over, strict HOA rules about everything from mailbox colours to grass height, and a kind of enforced neighbourliness that could feel either comforting or suffocating, depending on your mood. Our house was a modest colonial with blue shutters and a small front porch where David and I would sometimes sit in the evenings with coffee or wine, watching the world turn slower than it did everywhere else. We'd been married for 16 years. 16 years. That's not a short marriage by modern standards, and we'd built something real together. David worked in IT, steady income, no drama. We'd settled into that comfortable rhythm that comes with time, the kind where you finish each other's sentences and laugh at inside jokes that nobody else would understand. We didn't fight much. We didn't have kids, which had been a conscious choice after we'd tried for 3 years and nothing happened. It stung at first, but we'd made peace with it. Instead, we poured that energy into our home, our work, and our friendships. And then there was Natalie. Natalie Chen had been my best friend since our sophomore year of college, back when I was still figuring out who I was and what I wanted from life. We'd lived together for 2 years after graduation, worked terrible retail jobs while we figured out our careers, stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about boys and dreams, and what we'd do if we suddenly became millionaires. That kind of friendship is rare. It's the kind where you're not really friends, you're chosen family. Natalie had gotten married young, at 24, to a man named Robert. For the first decade, it seemed perfect. They'd bought a house 2 streets over from ours in Willowbrook, which was how we'd ended up living so close when David and I had bought our place. We'd had dinner together countless times, taken vacations as couples, been there for each other through David's mother's cancer scare and Natalie's miscarriage 5 years ago. That miscarriage had broken something in her, I thought. She'd wanted children desperately, and when it became clear that she probably couldn't have them, something about her uterus, the doctors had said, speaking in those gentle, careful tones they use when delivering bad news, she'd sunk into a depression that took almost a year to climb out of. But by last April, when all of this started, she seemed happy again, genuinely happy. She'd taken up yoga and had started volunteering at the animal shelter. She'd cut her long black hair into a sleek bob that made her look 10 years younger. When I'd run into her at the grocery store in early April, when the weather was finally turning warm and the trees were starting to bloom in that aggressive way they do in spring, she'd seemed lighter somehow, more like the girl I'd known in college. "Rebecca," she'd called out, waving from across the produce section. She was picking out avocados with the precision of a jeweler selecting diamonds. "I've been meaning to call you. David and I haven't done dinner in forever. I'd laughed and hugged her, breathing in her familiar perfume, versus something floral and expensive, the same brand she'd been wearing for years. I know. It's been, 3 months? I'd been crazy with work. We had that pile up on Route 9 that had me doing double shifts for 2 weeks straight. I heard about that, she'd said, and she'd looked at me with a kind of intensity that I'd found oddly compelling. You save people all the time. You're like a superhero, honestly. I'd waved that away. I just do my job. No, really, Natalie had pressed. You have no idea what a gift that is. To be able to help people when they're desperate. To be needed like that. She'd paused, selecting an avocado and turning it over in her hands. Not everyone can do what you do, Becca. Not everyone has that strength. It was a strange thing to say, and in retrospect, I should have noticed something off about it. But at the time, I just felt pleased that she appreciated what I did. Most people don't really understand what paramedics deal with. They see the uniform, the truck, the sirens, but they don't see the 16-year-old with a self-inflicted wound who spends the ambulance ride apologizing through tears. They don't see the elderly man who dies in your arms because his family couldn't afford his medications. They don't see the weight of it. So when Natalie said she appreciated me, I'd soaked it in like a plant that had been kept in the dark. We'd made plans for dinner that Friday night. She'd suggested a new Italian place in the downtown area, something she'd read about online. I'd agreed, though I'd mentioned I had a shift the next day and probably shouldn't stay out too late. Natalie had laughed and said she'd make sure I was home by 11. That dinner was the last normal evening I would have with my best friend. Looking back now, I can see all the small signs I'd missed. The way she'd kept asking me detailed questions about my finances, not in an intrusive way, but subtle. She'd asked about my emergency fund specifically. "Don't you worry about having enough set aside?" she'd asked, twirling pasta around her fork, "in case something happens to David?" I'd shrugged. "We have insurance. We're pretty secure." "But you're the strong one," she'd said quietly. "You're the one who takes care of people, who takes care of him." I'd laughed it off at the time. She'd also mentioned, over drinks, that Robert had been having some health issues. Nothing serious, she'd said, just some fatigue and joint pain. The doctors couldn't quite figure out what was causing it. She was worried about him, she'd said, because they only had his income now. Robert had been a real estate agent, and the market had been slow the past few months. She'd had to take a leave of absence from her job at the marketing firm where she worked as a project manager. Nothing permanent, she'd said, but the bills kept coming, you know? I'd sympathized. I'd even offered to help if she needed it, thinking she might be hinting at a loan. She'd touched my hand across the table and said I was the best friend she'd ever had, and that she'd never forget my kindness. I should have run right then. I should have gotten up, paid the check, and driven home and locked the doors. But I didn't, because I loved her, and because I was stupid, and because sometimes love and stupidity are the same thing. It was about a week later when Natalie called me at work. I was sitting in the paramedic station on a Tuesday afternoon, feet up on the desk, reading a novel during one of the slow periods that sometimes happens in emergency services. It was one of those perfect spring days where the weather is so nice it feels like an apology from nature. The kind of day where you remember why you live somewhere, instead of just surviving there. "Becca," Natalie said when I answered, and her voice was different, smaller, frightened. "I'm so sorry to call you at work, but I didn't know who else to contact." I sat up immediately, the novel falling to the floor. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "It's Robert," she said, and I could hear her crying, trying to hold it together but failing. "He collapsed this morning. I called the ambulance and they took him to County General. Becca, I'm at the hospital right now. The doctors are running tests, but they think it might be his heart." My chest tightened. Robert was only 42. "Oh my God. Okay. I'm leaving right now. I can be there in 20 minutes. "You don't have to." "I'm coming," I said firmly, already grabbing my keys. "I'm coming right now. What room is he in?" She gave me the room number, and I told my supervisor I had a family emergency. He waved me out without question. That's one advantage of working in emergency services. People understand that life happens. I drove to County General with a kind of focused urgency, my mind already running through the possibilities. Heart problems at 42 usually meant either genetic predisposition or lifestyle factors. Robert had always been a bit overweight, and he drank more than he probably should, but I wouldn't have called him obese. Still, you never really know what's going on inside someone's body until something goes wrong. I found Natalie in the waiting room outside the cardiac care unit, and she looked like she'd aged 5 years in the span of a morning. Her beautiful bob was pulled back in a messy clip, and her makeup was smudged from crying. She fell into my arms when she saw me, and I held her while she sobbed against my chest. "He's going to be okay," I said, making a promise I had no right to make. "Robert's strong. He's going to be fine." "They don't know what's wrong with him," she whispered. "They've done an EKG and blood work, but they said they need to do more tests. A catheterization, maybe. Becca, what if it's serious? What if something happens to him?" I pulled her to one of the uncomfortable waiting room chairs and sat with her, holding her hand while she cycled through fear and anxiety and desperate hope. Over the next several hours, as the tests continued and the doctors gradually ruled out the most serious possibilities, she clung to me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unstable. By evening, the diagnosis came through: early-stage cardiomyopathy, a weakening of the heart muscle. It was serious, but manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. Robert would need to take it easy for a while, avoid stress, watch his diet. It wasn't a death sentence, but it was a wake-up call. Natalie cried again when the cardiologist told us, but these were tears of relief, mixed with the shock of how close she'd come to losing her husband. I stayed with her until visiting hours ended, then drove her home. It was past midnight, and the suburban streets were empty and quiet. When I pulled into her driveway, she turned to me with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she said. "Seriously, Becca, you're my family. You're the only person who's really there for me." "That's what best friends are for," I said, and I meant it. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay," I said carefully. "If something happened to Robert," she said slowly, "if he got worse, or if anything happened, could I come stay with you and David for a while? Just until I get on my feet? I know we have insurance, but medical bills are going to be crazy, and the mortgage, and I need to know I have someone in my corner." My heart broke for her. "Of course you can. You know you can always stay with us. For as long as you need." She hugged me then, fierce and tight, and I felt like the best friend in the world. I felt needed. I felt like I was doing something that mattered. I should have recognized that feeling. It was the same feeling I got when I was running toward an emergency instead of away from it. It was the feeling of being called to action, of being essential. And looking back, I wonder if Natalie had recognized it too. If she'd known exactly which buttons to push to make me feel like a hero. Because that was when the real trouble started, though I didn't know it yet. That was the moment when everything began to unravel, even though on the surface, everything seemed to be coming together just fine. Robert improved over the next few weeks. He started cardiac rehabilitation and began taking his medications. By late April, he was back to something resembling normal, though he tired more easily and had to be careful about exertion. Life settled back into a rhythm, and I thought we'd all get through this intact. But then Natalie called me one evening in late April, just as I was getting home from a shift. Her voice was tight and small again. "I need your help," she said. "And I really need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you without judging me." I felt my stomach drop. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Can you come over?" she said. "Tonight? After David goes to bed?" And that was the beginning of everything that came after. That was the moment when my best friend began to set her trap, and I walked right into it with open arms, because that's what you do for the people you love. That's what I thought, anyway. I drove to Natalie's house that night after David fell asleep around midnight, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The streets of Willowbrook were dark and empty, the kind of quiet that only exists in suburbs after midnight, when everyone's behind closed doors pretending their lives make sense. I told myself I was just being a good friend, that this was what you did when someone you loved needed you. I didn't let myself think about the small voice in the back of my mind that had started whispering warnings. She answered the door before I even knocked, like she'd been waiting just inside. She was wearing the yoga clothes she seemed to live in these days, her hair pulled back, her face streaked with tears that looked fresh. "Thank God," she said, pulling me inside. "I didn't know if you'd come." "Of course I came," I said. "What's going on? You sounded terrified on the phone." She led me into the kitchen, which was lit by a single overhead light that made everything look harsh and clinical. On the table sat a stack of papers, and even from across the room, I could see they were medical bills. A lot of them. "It's Robert," she said, sitting down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. "The medication isn't working the way the doctors hoped. He's gotten worse. His cardiologist wants to try a different approach. There's this new treatment program, but it's not covered by insurance. Not entirely. It's going to cost us $30,000 over the next 6 months." I felt my stomach drop. 30,000? Natalie, that's... "I know what it is," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been trying everything. I called my parents, but they can't help. My dad's on disability and my mom's medical bills are already astronomical. I tried to get a personal loan, but the bank won't approve me. My credit's already shot from the medical bills we've already paid." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to save my husband's life and keep our house. And I came to you because you're the only person I trust. You're the only person who's ever been there for me." I sat down across from her, my mind racing. $30,000. That was more than 7 times what I had in my emergency fund. It was impossible. And yet, sitting there looking at my best friend's desperation, I found myself doing mental math anyway. If I gave her what I had, $4,700, that would cover part of it. It wouldn't be enough, but it would be something. It would be proof that I cared, that I was willing to sacrifice for her. "How much do you need right away?" I heard myself asking. She looked at me like I'd just offered her the moon. "You'd do that? You'd help me?" "I have about 4,000 in savings," I said slowly, hating myself even as I said it. "It's not much, but..." "Rebecca," she said, reaching across the table and gripping my hand. "That would help so much. That's the deposit for the treatment program. If I can give them that, they'll work with us on a payment plan for the rest." I remember the exact moment I agreed to give her the money. I remember the feeling of stepping off a cliff in slow motion, still believing I wouldn't fall. I remember thinking that this was what love looks like. Sacrifice. Putting someone else's needs before your own. Being the strong one who could handle it. I was so very, very wrong. The transfer happened the next morning. Natalie picked me up before work and drove me to my bank. I withdrew the cash, $4,700, mostly in hundreds and fifties, and handed it to her in an envelope while sitting in her car in the bank parking lot. She cried and hugged me, and I felt like a hero. I felt like I'd done something that mattered, something that would save a life. "This buys us time," she said. "Real time. And I'm going to pay you back, Becca. I promise you. As soon as Robert's stable and I can pick up more hours at work, I'm going to pay back every single cent." I believed her. Of course I believed her. 2 weeks later, I started to get suspicious. It happened by accident. I ran into Sandra, one of Natalie's neighbors, a woman I knew vaguely from community events, at the grocery store. We exchanged pleasantries in the produce section, and then Sandra said something that made my blood run cold. How's Natalie doing? I heard Robert's been having some health stuff. I nodded. Yeah, he's been dealing with some heart issues. It's been rough. Sandra made a sympathetic noise. That's what I figured. I saw him out jogging yesterday morning. Looked like he was really pushing it too. Doing those sprint intervals where you're just flying down the street. I went very still. You saw Robert jogging? Yesterday? Yeah, down by the park, Sandra said cheerfully. He looked healthy as a horse, honestly. Whatever his problem is, it's not slowing him down. I excused myself as quickly as I could and finished my shopping in a daze. Robert wasn't supposed to be doing anything strenuous. His cardiologist had been explicit about that. If his condition was as serious as Natalie claimed, he wouldn't be sprinting intervals. That wasn't how heart disease worked. The seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't unplant it. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I called Robert directly, something I rarely did. When he answered, he sounded fine. Better than fine, he sounded cheerful. Hey, Rebecca, he said, what's up? Hey, Robert, I said, my mouth dry. I just wanted to check in on you, see how you're feeling after your new treatment. There was a pause. Treatment? What are you talking about? Natalie said you were starting a special program for your heart? Something not covered by insurance? Another pause, longer this time. Becca, I don't know what Natalie told you, but I'm not in any special treatment program. The medication the cardiologist prescribed is working fine. I'm doing great, actually. The doctor said I can probably start light exercise in a couple of weeks. The room tilted. Robert, Natalie told me that you were getting worse, that you needed $30,000 for treatment. $30,000? He sounded genuinely shocked. What? No, Becca, I'm fine. My insurance is covering everything. Natalie didn't mention any of this to me. I hung up shortly after, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, trying to process what I'd just learned. Natalie had lied to me. Not a small lie, a massive, calculated lie designed to separate me from my money. And it had worked. I called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, sounding concerned. Becca, is everything okay? You sound upset. I just got off the phone with Robert, I said flatly. He says he's not in any special treatment program. He says his condition is stable and his insurance is covering everything. He says he's fine. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Natalie, what did you do? Rebecca, I can explain, she said, and her voice had changed. It was softer now, more manipulative. I know it sounds bad, but… Bad? You stole $4,000 from me. $4,000 that I've been saving for years. I didn't steal anything, she said, her voice taking on a hard edge. You gave it to me. You wanted to give it to me. You made me feel like you actually cared about me and my family. I do care about you, I said, my voice rising. That's why I gave you the money. Because I love you and I thought you needed help. And now you're angry that I needed help, she said. That's classic, Rebecca. That's so typical of you. You help people because it makes you feel good about yourself. It's not really about helping. It's about being the hero, the strong one, the paramedic who saves everyone. I felt like I'd been slapped. That's not fair. Isn't it? Her voice was cold now, completely different from the desperate, tearful friend I'd tried to help. You have no idea what my life is actually like, Rebecca. You and David with your perfect little house and your perfect marriage and your stable job. You look at me and you see someone to rescue, not a person. And when I asked for help, you gave it to me so fast, so eager to be the good friend, the good person. You didn't even question it. Because I trusted you, I said, and I could hear the betrayal in my own voice. You were my best friend. You still are my best friend. No, she said, I'm not. I haven't been for a very long time. She hung up on me. I sat in the dark for a long time after that, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman I'd known for 21 years had apparently been someone completely different all along. The question was, how long had she been planning this? Had the miscarriage been real, or had that been part of the setup? Had the dinner conversations and the vulnerable moments and the late-night talks all been calculated manipulation? Or had something broken in her at some point? Something that made her decide she was entitled to take what she wanted from the people who loved her. I didn't sleep that night. David asked me the next morning if I was okay, and I told him I was just tired from work. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what had happened, not yet. The shame was too raw, too humiliating. I'd been played by someone I'd trusted completely, and I didn't know how to explain that to my husband without sounding like an idiot. Over the next few days, I did what any desperate person does. I tried to get the money back. I called Natalie repeatedly. She either didn't answer or hung up immediately. I drove to her house 3 times, and each time, she wouldn't come to the door. The third time, Robert answered, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Rebecca," he said, "I think it's best if you don't come by anymore. Natalie's going through something, and she's made it clear she doesn't want to see you." "I just need her to give me back the money," I said. "I don't even need an apology. I just need that $4,000 back." "I understand," he said, and he actually did look sympathetic. "But she's not going to do that. She's already spent it, and frankly, I don't think she cares if you're angry with her. I think she's already moved on." That was when I realized the full scope of what had happened. She hadn't just stolen my money, she'd stolen my best friend. The person I'd been closest to for more than 2 decades had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And somehow, I was the one who felt ashamed. I finally told David what had happened on a Thursday evening, about a week after the phone call with Robert. I'd been sitting on it for days and it was eating me alive. We were sitting on the porch with wine, the same porch where we'd sat countless times before, and I just broke down and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I loved about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You gave her the money because you loved her," he said finally. "I gave her the money because I was stupid," I said. "No," he said. "You gave her the money because you're a good person who loves her friend. The fact that she took advantage of that says something about her, not about you." I wanted to believe that, but the anger was already setting in, underneath the shock and the shame. The anger was a living thing inside my chest, growing every day. I decided to contact a lawyer. I know that sounds extreme, but I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I was thinking like someone who'd been hurt, and I wanted Natalie to hurt the way I was hurting. My lawyer, a woman named Patricia Huang who specialized in small claims cases, listened to my story and then told me something I didn't expect. "Technically," she said, "you could file a civil suit against her. You have documentation of the withdrawal, and you have testimony from her husband that the story she told you was false. You'd have a case." "What would that involve?" I asked. "A small claims court hearing," she said. "You'd present your evidence, she'd present hers, and the judge would decide. If you win, she'd be ordered to pay you back. And if I lose? Then you're out the filing fees and court costs, and the friendship is definitely over." The friendship was already over, I thought. Had been over before she ever asked me for the money, if I was being honest with myself. I filed the paperwork the next day. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks of living with this anger, this sense of violation. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts, exhausting myself so thoroughly that I could barely think by the time I got home. David was patient with me, though I could see the concern in his eyes. We stopped going out socially. I stopped calling my other friends. My entire world had contracted down to this one betrayal, this one wound that wouldn't heal. And then, about 3 weeks before the hearing, something happened that changed everything. I was running a call in downtown, not far from Natalie's office, the one where she supposedly worked as a project manager at a marketing firm. The call was for a woman who'd collapsed at a restaurant, and we were transporting her to County General. As I was pushing the stretcher toward the ambulance, I glanced up and saw Natalie standing outside a coffee shop across the street. She wasn't alone. She was standing very close to a man I'd never seen before, a man who wasn't Robert, and she was smiling. Not just smiling, she was laughing. Her whole face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. The man had his hand on her back, and when she said something to him, he leaned down and kissed her. I stood there holding the stretcher, frozen, watching my best friend kiss another man in broad daylight. A patient I was supposed to be taking care of was lying on the stretcher beneath my hands, and I couldn't move. I couldn't process what I was seeing. My partner, Marcus, looked at me with concern. "You okay, Hartley?" "Yeah," I said automatically. "Yeah, I'm fine. Let's get her loaded up." I finished the shift in a kind of fog. The entire drive to the hospital, the patient handoff, the paperwork, all of it felt like I was watching someone else do it. Because if Natalie was having an affair, if she was spending time with another man, then maybe the money wasn't even about Robert's medical treatment. Maybe it was about this man. Maybe she'd lied to me so she could spend time with her boyfriend while pretending to be at home with her husband. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Not David, not my lawyer, not Marcus. I just sat with the knowledge like a stone in my chest, and I waited for the court date. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in early June. The courthouse was a gray, institutional building downtown, the kind of place where truth was supposed to matter more than anything else. Natalie was already there when I arrived, sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom with an older woman I didn't recognize. She didn't look at me. When our eyes met for just a second, she looked away deliberately, and that small gesture of dismissal somehow hurt worse than if she'd sneered at me. Patricia had advised me to stick to the facts and not let my emotions get the better of me. "Just present the evidence," she'd said. "Let the judge decide." But when we got into the courtroom and the judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, asked me to present my case, I found that the facts weren't enough. They felt small and insufficient compared to the magnitude of what had actually happened. I explained how Natalie had come to me with a story about Robert's health crisis. I explained how desperate she'd seemed, how frightened. I explained how she'd told me about the treatment program and the $30,000, and how I'd given her everything I had. I presented the bank withdrawal records, the text messages where she'd thanked me profusely and promised to pay me back. Then Natalie's lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit, stood up and said something that made my blood run cold. "Your Honor, my client contests that this was a loan. Ms. Hartley provided this money as a gift to her friend during a time of personal crisis. There is no documentation of a loan agreement, no agreed-upon repayment schedule, and no promissory note. Without such documentation, this is not a recoverable debt." Patricia stood up. "Your Honor, the text messages clearly indicate that the defendant promised to repay this money." "The text messages indicate gratitude," the lawyer said smoothly, "not a legal promise to repay. And in any case, my client is going through significant financial hardship at this moment, which would make repayment impossible." I felt my hands clenching into fists. Natalie was sitting at the table next to her lawyer, and she still wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight ahead, her face completely blank. The judge looked at me. "Ms. Hartley, you are aware that for a civil suit involving the recovery of money, there generally needs to be clear documentation of a loan agreement." "I didn't think I needed documentation," I said, and I could hear the desperation in my own voice. She was my best friend. I trusted her. "That," the judge said not unkindly, "is often the problem in these cases." She ruled in Natalie's favor. The money was determined to be a gift, not a loan, and therefore not recoverable. I sat there in the courtroom, listening to the judge explain that friendship and trust were not legal concepts, and I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. I stood up to leave, and that was when I finally made eye contact with Natalie. She was looking at me now, and there was something in her expression, a kind of cold triumph, that told me she'd known this would happen. She'd known all along that she could take my money and I'd have no legal recourse. She'd counted on it. That was when I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but I was so far past smart at that point that it didn't matter. I walked straight out of the courthouse and drove to the county records office. It took me about an hour of searching, but I found what I was looking for: Natalie Chen and Robert Chen's property records, their mortgage information, and their most recent home assessment. I wrote down all the details on a piece of paper, and then I drove to the police station. I told the officer at the desk that I wanted to file a report for fraud and theft. The officer looked skeptical. Small claims court had already ruled, after all, but I asked to speak to a detective. When I explained that I believed the fraud had involved a fabricated medical emergency and a